On today's Truth Factor discussion, we're going to be giving consideration to Luke chapter 21. Jesus there is going to foretell the destruction of the temple as well as Jerusalem. He'll talk some about the coming of the Son of Man, and then use a parable to show the need to be watchful as well as prepared. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us today for this time period of studying the Word of God, of factoring the truth of God's Word into our lives and hopefully your life as well. We have found some very interesting passages throughout the course of our study of Luke. This one right here is right up there with one of the more challenging chapters, and we're going to do our best to look at it. There are a lot of erroneous teachings that revolve around it that we won't necessarily take time to deal with, but at least try to share our understanding of what the truth is regarding this chapter. But before we get to that point, I'm going to pass it over to Paul. And Paul, if you would, let our guests at home know how they can participate in today's study.
I'd be happy to do that. As we look at this, we would understand that if you want to participate with our study today, rather than just watching us, we'd love to have your comments and questions. And as you look at that, you might consider going to youtube.com, and it's youtube.com/truthfactorlive, and you can see us there. You could also go to Twitter, and our Twitter is /truthfactor, or Facebook /truthfactorlive, and any of those places will get you to the right place. We try to bring those comments and questions in as we study along together, and we really appreciate that, because our very best online Bible studies that we've had have been when you join in with us.
Absolutely, Paul, and I appreciate that. Paul, I'm going to take this opportunity to invite everyone to, and we'll do this at the end of our study, but please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you haven't done that, if you're watching through YouTube, subscribe there. Click on the notification bell, the icon, so you'll receive notifications when we go live. And if you just really prefer Facebook, then follow us on Facebook as well. Appreciate you doing
John mentions that because there's some benefits that come to us, not monetary benefits, but some features of Facebook that would be really nice for us to have.
Or
they
YouTube.
only give people who are YouTube. YouTube will only give to people who have at least 100 subscribers. And so if you would subscribe, we would truly appreciate that. It would make a difference.
Paul, this is something new, I'd say probably within the last year and a half, because this Truth Factor Live, I was able to get access to those features just by validating or verifying through my phone. I didn't have to have 100 subscribers. Now, you have to. And
yeah, it's a new policy that they instituted a while back, and for anyone with any kind of YouTube channel to be able to get an easy to remember YouTube handle, have to have the 100 subscribers.
Yep, exactly. So we're not pleading for money.
Oh, no.
We want your subscription. All right, let's see. We're considering today Luke chapter 21, and we're going to start with the first 4 verses here. And Tom, would you mind reading for us Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4?
Okay, be glad to do that. It says, and he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, truly I say to you, that this poor widow has put in more than them all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had.
All right, Tom, I appreciate you reading that for us. All right, let's give a couple of considerations here to this short little section here. But before we do that, I want to ask the chat room. Here's your question, and Brian is dropping this into the Facebook as well as the YouTube chat. Do you have any thoughts on how much the widow gave? Can I kind of think about that as we go through our study this morning? Do you have any thoughts regarding how much the widow gave? Now, Brian, I know Tom read this, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this to you, if you would. What is the main lesson do you see within this particular text?
John, I suspect that the main point here is that God doesn't measure what we're giving to him by the numeric value, but instead as a measure of what we are able to give to him. We might compare this lesson to the same lesson we find in other places, like the parable of the talents, where each man was given something different and he returned a portion of what he had or a percentage of what he had back to the Lord. So I think that what we're supposed to see here is the things that we give God aren't measured on the amount numerically, which would be what man would measure, but instead on our ability to give.
I would think so. I would think so as well. What I'm unfamiliar with, and I was telling Paul this, and I really didn't take the time necessary to answer this question. What gift was this? One thing I did read said they had different boxes throughout the temple there that Herod had built, and this is where people would bring essentially a donation. What I couldn't find is if this was governed by like the 10% rule seen in part of the Levitical law, if this was just bring whatever you had as a gift. But definitely here Jesus stands watching, and he makes a definite observation regarding this lady compared to the others. So no.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I don't know if maybe the guys have some thoughts on that. I'm not exactly sure what the gift was that she'd be laying in this manner.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't know. I tell you what, bear with me for just a moment. Tom, do you have any thoughts or comments on this?
Not in particular. I mean, it's just pretty straightforward, as you know, the premise of the text. She gave out of her, or she gave everything that she had, versus they're not doing that. So,
okay. The other question that I had that I want us to consider real quick, there within the text, is might there be a direct connection between what Jesus said in the previous chapter, verses 45 through 47, where he talks about how the Pharisees who devour widows' houses, and this particular observation regarding the widow. The reason why I asked this, if you kind of stop for a minute and set the stage, and I failed to kind of do that at the start of our study, but if you stop and set the stage, Jesus is in the temple, and he has been doing some talking. Go back to the previous chapter, and he then turns and makes this observation regarding this woman and what she gives. Paul, do you think that maybe there might be a connection?
Certainly, I think the reference that you had mentioned to me previously is in Luke chapter 20, and I was looking there at 45 through 47 as we look at that scripture, and he talks about these scribes, as you mentioned, that they devoured widows' houses. Maybe they tried to compel them to be giving for other means or something like that. And certainly, we do see that while we talked last time about the Pharisees and the scribes being possibly very devout, many of them in their religion, that there were some who were very dishonest and were very greedy. And so I would encourage us to think about this contrast here. Here's a woman who she just wants to give all that she can give, contrasted to the scribes here who are wanting to take all they can take.
Yeah.
You know. Also, one source that I just kind of briefly glanced at was kind of making the observation that it's possible that, or we don't know exactly what the disposition of the religious leaders was as this was being done. You know, were those who were giving out of their abundance, were they announcing it? You know, were they making a great show of it? Were there people observing the putting of the money into the box? And maybe when they saw the idea, you know, when you get to how much money this was, with that question that you asked everybody, you know, was it possible that there were religious leaders who saw that and maybe look down upon the woman as, why are you wasting our time with this pittance of a donation here, type of a thing. So you could have judgment being passed, which would go back to the previous section with the hypocrisy. It talked about the pretense. They make long prayers and all those types of things as they took advantage of other people, just basically exposing their hypocrisy and attitude and so on.
Okay, Paul or Tom, I appreciate that. Well, let's go ahead and take a minute and jump into the chat room. It looks like we've got a couple of comments there, and I appreciate y'all noticing that I had failed to update the episode number and chapter. So we've corrected that here real quick. But let's go ahead and bring in a couple of comments here, and I'm going to start with. Please ignore what you see on the screen because here is the new one. There we go. Stephen James says, the widow appears to understand that the Lord provides, and she knows that God will help her to survive. Perhaps we should all think that way. And it does read that regarding her monetary possession there, that she gave all that she had, and therefore apparently trusted in the Lord to take care of her. And when you think about Matthew, let's see, when you think of Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, you think about the Lord promising to provide for us. It may not be the greatest of quality of things that everybody else has, but as Paul says, with food and clothing, therewith I will be content. He will give us and make sure that we have everything that we need to live. We also find, going back into the chat room, Gregory, and bring this up. Gregor says, it'd be like giving my last $1,000 for the month. That would mean no food, no rent, and no gas. It was all the money she had. Mites were a very small amount, but if it was all that you have, then you had, sorry, I'm doing a horrible job. But if it's all that you had, then it would be the value of great value to you. And so for her, what she gave of great value because it was all that she had left. Yeah. All right, gentlemen, any thoughts or comments?
I apologize.
No, go right ahead. You're good.
I was thinking about this, and sometimes we talk about the rich being very greedy, but I don't think that greed is a problem that is limited to the rich. Sometimes poor people can be just as greedy. They're just not as successful with their greed. And here is a woman that not only is poor, but she is generous. She is liberal with her giving. She gives as much as she can. And so I think that's a good point as well. They saw the rich giving, but sometimes even the poor can be stingy or greedy with their money. So not only was she not like the rich who would make a show of their giving, but she was not like the poor man who would just say, "Oh, I'm not going to give anything because let somebody else do it." So,
well, and if you couple with that covetousness, you think about that for a minute, and then look at our modern day lottery system. I don't have a quote for this, but I want to say that I've heard that probably the majority of the money that comes into the lottery doesn't come from rich people. It comes from people who are just barely surviving. But it's their prayer, an answer to a prayer if they win to get out of their poverty.
Well, they say that people who buy lottery tickets are people who are poor at math. But anyway.
I like that. Go ahead, Tom. What were you saying?
Yeah. I was going to say, a lot of time it's done out of desperation and so on. I also read a resource real quick that said that this 2 mites would have been something like maybe a 50th or an 80th of a day's wage when you start breaking it down compared to the denarius and so on. So I mean we would weigh this in somebody tossing in a couple of pennies. I think there's versions that do that, or maybe even just a couple of dollars when we look at how much we make today. Somebody tossing in those amounts, and don't forget she loved the Lord. I also see that in her willingness to do this. There's a love for the Lord in all of this.
That's a good point. It's a very good point, Tom. Very good point. All right, well, let's go ahead and jump into the next portion. Like this was if this was a swimming pool, verses 1 through 4 was the shallow end. Now let's kind of head off into the deep end a little bit. And Brian, if you would, read for us verses 5 through 19 of this text.
Very good. Thank you for asking, John. And I'll be reading from the New King James Version of the Bible, Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 19. Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." So they asked him, saying, "Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "Take heed that you not be deceived. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is drawn near. Therefore do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences. There will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. But before all these things they will lay their hands on you, persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You'll be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you'll be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair on your head shall be lost. By your patience, preserve your souls."
Thank you, Brian. All right, Brian, there's a couple of things that I think is very interesting regarding the text that you've just read. First off, take the scenery again. They're standing there, they're watching people, and they've observed people putting in their gifts and everything. Somebody brings up the conversation, "Isn't this a nice temple?" And maybe this gifts will help build and continue to build the beautiful temple and so forth. And then here's Jesus saying, time is coming when this temple will be torn down. So in a minute we'll talk about what he's discussing there. But I wonder, when you look at the question in verse 7, what do you think his disciples are actually asking?
It's a very interesting question, because what Jesus said had to be, well, there's a couple of thoughts you might say here. First of all, it's a shock. The temple hadn't really been built all that long, this iteration of the temple. It had started by Herod the Great, and there were still buildings on the outside being finished around, not the temple itself, but the outer perimeters of it that were still being worked on. And it was, it's never really truly called one of the wonders of the world, but it really was a wonder. It really was an incredible building that just got finished, and Jesus is telling them not one stone will stand on the other. So your question is, what do we think that they're asking about? And what I think is interesting is they don't act very surprised. They seem to understand that Jesus is talking about the temple and the temple being torn apart. And I would suggest that we are meant to understand why they're not really surprised that Jesus is saying this. And I don't know if, John, you were kind of alluding to this, but maybe I'll take a second to say that way back in Luke chapter 4, Jesus, when he first introduced himself, quoted a very important passage out of Isaiah 61. In that passage, it was actually Jesus speaking through the prophet Isaiah 700 years before, talking about the message that he was going to bring. And part of that message would be the gospel, the good news, he calls it the favorable year there. But then the second verse says, the second portion of the same passage that is not quoted in Luke chapter 4, but is omitted because what it actually is, it's being spoken of right here, is the day of vengeance. So in other words, the Messiah was coming to say two things. Number one, the mercy of God, and number two, the day of vengeance. So it might be the case that they're not real shocked about this question, because there's always been an understanding that one of the things Messiah was going to do was to preach the vengeance of God, and all sorts of prophets, whether it was Isaiah or Zechariah, understood that that meant the vengeance of God on Israel, and that was something that was always understood. So, John, kind of stepping back to your question, why are they asking? What are they talking about? Why is it they asked this question? They perceive Jesus is telling them the temple is going to be destroyed. They understood, or at least maybe they understood, that the prophecy about the destruction of the temple was one of the works of the Messiah. So they've perhaps been waiting for this passage, this statement to come. We might make a note to say that it's no coincidence this is the last sermon that Jesus will preach in a public sense.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. There definitely would be some precursor. Where am I hearing the echo from? Okay, it's gone. There had been some precursor information shared with them that would have prepared them for, at least to some level, for this time. Yeah. Tom, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just real quickly, it's kind of interesting later on when accusations are made against Jesus. One of the charges that is made is that he said he would destroy the temple and in 3 days build it back up. And they knew that he was talking about the physical structure. Well, here Jesus is repeating to his disciples, this is going to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Not so much the 3 days, because that was his body, but
Right, but it would be destroyed. In the chat room, and it's already been shared in the chat room, the question I'd like for y'all to consider, and it might seem a little bit broad, but in the span of verses 5 through 19, how would Jesus' disciples have taken the warnings in this section? Or how do you think they should have taken the warnings within this section? But let me go ahead and move on to a question for Paul. Let me throw this to you. Jesus said, "For these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." What do you think he's referring to when he says the end?
There's a couple of thoughts about that. It may be the thought, something very simple, that it would begin and then some time would pass before the destruction will be complete. Or he may be saying that this is not the end of all things. This will be a big transition that will take place. It may be that as we look at this, I know I'm saying a lot of maybes, but it may be that as the kingdom was beginning to be preached and the kingdom would come, that it would not be on that very moment when the gospel was first preached that the temple would be destroyed, but there was going to be a period of time in which events would transpire and would take place.
Yeah. See, what I find interesting about this chapter, or about this section, it sounds very familiar to his warnings when he's about to send them out on the limited commission. It sounds very similar to those times when when he's still with them, and they would have to go through certain persecutions. And then even in his discussion with them in John chapters 14 through 16, he talks about, he'll die and then he'll be with them for a short time, and then he'll leave them and everything. There are these warnings and so forth. And there's a lot about this section that to me sounds like he's talking about the span of time that would be from the moment of their discussion, his time with them, to just before the destruction of Jerusalem. Let me jump back over to the Bible program real quick and kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here with some of these phrases I think are very, very interesting. First off, let's see. You've got the hearing of wars and commotions and so forth. In other words, don't worry about it. Nations going to rise against nations, famines, pests. In other words, life is going to go on. Before all these things happen, look at verse 12. They will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and the prisons. You'll be brought before kings and rulers. It'll turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Think about Paul going before Agrippa. Therefore, settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you'll answer. I'll give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You'll be betrayed even by your parents. All this sounds like he's talking to his disciples about what they are going to have to go through before the destruction of Jerusalem. Does that sound somewhat reasonable? Any thoughts or comments on that?
You know, one thing that's kind of interesting is that under the limited commission, they were only to go out to the children of Israel. This is something telling them that they're going to be going beyond the children of Israel. If they're going to be brought up before kings and rulers and such of that like, well, that is a necessary inference that it's not just the Jews that we're talking about anymore. And I think that that's perhaps part of the inconceivable portion of the Great Commission, that, or not inconceivable, but that which was lost at first, not understood at first, was that this commission would be to all the world, to everybody, to the Jews and to the Gentiles. We see that by Acts chapter 10, when it is going to the Gentiles, there's still a great deal of misunderstanding and confusion about that, but that it's clear from the beginning, this was a message meant to go out to the whole world, and even here, it's being told to us that that was the case.
Yeah. And much like thinking about Paul going before Agrippa, would be an example of that. And if you look forward, I guess later in time, when the Apostle John, in the unwritten, recorded, the time of his life that is unrecorded, he probably had to give answer. What he ends up exiled on the Isle of Patmos and everything. He probably stood before those in authority as well. All right, let's see. Any thoughts or comments? There was one question I wanted to consider before we headed on. Okay, yeah. Brian, do you think in verses 12 through 19, Jesus is talking primarily to his disciples?
Yeah, I do. And I think that, again, the idea of the words that are given to them, not to be prepared beforehand, that's a pretty unique to the apostles kind of statement. Yeah. But of course, we could apply that to say the words that we speak aren't from our own purpose, but are given to us too. So I guess you could bring that forth to say that that's a from then on kind of statement. I do think, though, that we're really just looking at the disciples.
Yeah. Except for the thought about don't meditate upon what you're going to say. I got to meditate a lot upon what I'm going to say.
Right. Yeah, that certainly can't be us. That's kind of an interesting statement, though, isn't it?
Yep.
Don't even think about what you're going to say. What an unusual charge for them of how certain they needed to be about standing before somebody.
Yeah, but
I wonder,
well,
go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say, but also when I see that, don't forget that they were in the times of spiritual gifts.
Granted.
And with the incomplete written revelation, obviously the Holy Spirit would be putting words into their mouth as needed, those kind of, or thoughts and so on. Yeah. And so I kind of see a little bit of that in this.
Could it be something as simple as what we would say, don't worry about what you're going to say?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because you'll know what to say at that moment.
Yeah, it was going to be given to them. And again, you mentioned earlier the limited commission, like Luke 10 or 11 or whatever. That was something that was emphasized there as well, especially when you go over Matthew's account of that. It's very clear that you're going to be given help in what you need. Of course, our idea of not having to worry about what to say is because we're prepared, which means we know the Word of God well enough that we can give an answer for the hope in us.
That's right. All right. Any other thoughts before I jump over to the chat room on this section?
Maybe just one other point, John. Maybe not entirely in the text here, but we know that in the parallel text in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus talks about the suffering that they would be undergoing. And one of the things that I often think about is he says that there would never be a suffering like that again. Sometimes, a lot of times, we kind of look ahead to the future with trepidation, and we say, "Oh man, it looks like it's getting worse and worse. We're going to be suffering like in a way that's unbelievable." But according to the Word of God, the worst suffering or the worst persecution, the worst tribulation Christians would experience isn't ahead of us; it's behind us, as far as the church goes. And I take a little bit of comfort in that, knowing that while sometimes it looks dark days ahead, that the real, truly terrible persecutions are now in the past, according to the Scriptures.
That's a very good point. Any other thoughts? There's a possibility I may have to step away shortly. I'll know that here in just a moment. Let's go ahead and jump to the chat room then. And the question was, how should Jesus' disciples have taken the warnings in the section? So let's take a look at some of the answers or thoughts there within the chat room. We'll start with Stephen James. He says, one point that is almost lost is that Christ would put words in the mouths of the disciples. With little or no education, these men couldn't speak with any authority or eloquence without divine assistance. All right, that's a pretty interesting thought, and I like that point. They weren't speaking of their own accord. They were speaking with the authority that Christ had given them, the words that he had given them. Any thoughts about that? All right, Gregor, he goes on to say that they would be persecuted beyond belief and their behavior would inspire others. But at some point, all they knew would no longer be what was important. Without the physical temple, there is no Judaism. Now, there's something there that I want to take a moment to kind of talk about for just a minute, and I appreciate what Gregor is saying there. When you look at the history of God's people, and you go back through, after David took the city of Jerusalem, and he basically made the capital there, moved the tabernacle there from Hebron, I believe it was. Then the temple was built up. Jerusalem became a favored place of God, if you'd kind of allow me to say it that way. You look throughout the prophecies, and he talks about the restoration of it. You look at the latter part of Isaiah and so forth. It was a wonderful place. It was a glorious place. When the people followed God, his presence was there. When they departed from him, his presence was not there. And throughout all these years, it was where the presence of God was, as long as they walked with him. Now that's all changing. And this is a very major change that they're going to go through. Even the Jews converted to the truth, there had to be a mark of sadness, like Jesus when he weeps over what he saw. This was a major change that was about to take place. Any thoughts, guys? All right, let's jump back to the chat room again. And Stephen says, yes, John, the disciples, and we are disciples, would suffer greatly before the end, whether it be the judgment on Jerusalem, later tribulations all over the world, or the end of time. And I think that's a very good point. That's one of the lessons we saw when we were studying through 1st and 2nd Peter. Peter talks about the sufferings that the people of God would have to go through and would go through the course of time. Very good point. Any thoughts on that? And then the last one that we have so far is Gregor says Jesus was talking to his disciples. John, in Revelation, he spoke similar ideas of the destruction to the global church. And I wonder if what Gregor is talking about, and I kind of see part of Revelation the same way, is he was warning the brethren of this great persecution that was to come and would last for many, many years. But as long as they held true to the Lord, they would be able to overcome. So, all right, any thoughts or comments so far? Good, Brian, you look like you got a thought in your head, or at least that's what Hangouts was painting a picture of.
Well, that's the bad video quality that makes it look that way.
Oh, is that it? All right, let's see here. I'll have to step away here hang on just a second. There we go.
Do you need for one of us to take over, John?
Not right at this moment. We'll about to find out here shortly. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. I appreciate all the thoughts in the chat room there. Sorry for a little bit of the distraction there, but we will continue. All right, let's see. Who has not read? Paul, you've not read yet, have you?
No, sir.
All righty, if you would, read verses 20 through 24 of Luke chapter 21.
Be happy to do that. John mentioned Luke 21:20 through 24. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and take a minute, and it looks like that Brian has already shared into the chat room for us the question for this particular section. So let me pop that up on the screen for the folks who are at home. Does verses 20 through 24 tell us why God allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed? Does verses 20 through 24 tell us why God allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed? All right, let's come back to the text here, Paul, that you just read for us. And in this particular section here, there seems to be little doubt whatsoever that he is now actually talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. There seems to be little doubt. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree with that. Here he talks about, the focus is Jerusalem, those who are in the region of Judea, those who are in the city, those who are in the country, very specific directions given because of this desolation that will take place.
Yeah. And it's interesting, although we're not going to take time to look at even a portion of it, but Josephus has some interesting information regarding the description of the destruction of Jerusalem and things that took place leading up to it and everything. But everything that Jesus foretold that would happen, especially the fact that it would be inundated with Gentiles. This came true some 40 years later. But Brian, I'm going to throw this question to you because you kind of introduced it earlier, and I really appreciate you doing that. When he talks about or uses the phrase the day of vengeance, let's talk a little bit more about that regarding the desolation of Jerusalem and this day of vengeance.
Yeah, thanks, John. So the passage that we're referring to here is Isaiah chapter 61. And I'm going to go ahead and read it. We mentioned it before, and I probably jumped the gun and should have waited till I got to your question here, and I apologize for getting ahead of you on that. But the passage Isaiah 61, I'm going to read Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Now, the language here in Isaiah 61, I mentioned before, we understand that this is Jesus. In fact, but we don't need to understand that because Jesus actually says in Luke chapter 4, verse 18, this is me. I'm talking about me here. And then he goes on, though, in verse 2 to say, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. And so that term day of vengeance, very likely in Luke, since Luke starts Jesus's ministry with this passage, this is the end of Jesus's ministry. Now, like I said, I kind of like to bookend Jesus's ministry between, in this verse, beginning and end, the day of vengeance is the proclamation of God's judgment on Jerusalem. Now, in Matthew 24, and even Matthew 23, Jesus elaborates, or Matthew gives more of Jesus's wording about this, about why they had earned this vengeance. They had rejected the prophets. They had dishonored God. And Jesus, in several parables, would say that the master was going to send the prophets, then he would send his son. And when they rejected his son, then, like one prophet, one of Jesus's parables says, then he will destroy their city. So this was a sense where these things were understood, that was what was going to come. God's vengeance on Jerusalem, his bringing out justice to their rejection of him.
Brian, when you think about the history that I was talking about earlier in conjunction with what you just said, there had been a lot of terrible things take place in Jerusalem throughout the years. The people had even worshipped idols within the city, walls and everything. But never had there been anything as serious as them having put on trial and executed the one whom God sent to save man.
Right. And that would be something that that they would, in some sense, most of the people there would have some accountability for. I mean, they're all going to be shouting, "Crucify him!" within the next day. So that's not just something a few Jews bear guilt for. It was something that many of the people of Jerusalem would be guilty for.
That's right. I mean,
Now,
even
what's interesting. Oh,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, John. I was just going to say, what's interesting is Acts chapter 2, we see some of those Jews express their regret and their acceptance of Christ. Now, part of Jesus's prophecy here is to tell those who are his how to escape this judgment. So ironically, any of those that wanted to could avoid this if they just
the
would obey
destruction.
Christ. Yeah, the destruction. I'm sorry, the
Yeah.
destruction of Jerusalem. Yeah,
Yeah.
even the destruction of Jerusalem itself. That Jesus said, when you see, well, that's where we're at right now. When you see this sign, you need to leave. Well, obedience to Jesus delivers you from destruction.
Yeah. And if they were watching when the soldiers began to gather around, I'd heard that Josephus says there was a point where people could have left.
Right. It's really interesting how that's a pretty straightforward record. We think it has something to do with maybe some of the political problems in Rome, and Vespasian starts the assault and then he leaves to go to Rome, and his son continues it. There's a lot of different political mechanisms going on there that just as you say, and it looks like Jesus is prophesying this when he's talking about this, this moment you'll have to escape, that there was a moment, and there seems to be some historical evidence of precisely what that was about.
It's interesting, very interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
One thing about Manasseh. Manasseh passed his children through the fire. And so God basically, despite Josiah's righteousness, he says, that's it's too far. And so he sends them off into Babylon captivity. There's no coming back from what they're about to do here as far as the city itself. There's no coming back. It will. I think it's Arthur Ogden, in his book on Revelation. Now, he takes the earlier date, but he takes it from the standpoint of the Lord avenging the apostles and prophets, the destruction of Jerusalem, for that purpose.
One other point to bring up, John, is that this is history repeating itself too. That God had sent a Gentile, he calls it the time of the Gentiles, and that term might have actually clicked in and brought some memory to them, because there had been another time of the Gentiles. That was when the Babylonians had come in and had sacked the city as well, had come in and completely devastated Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, much like was about to be destroyed. Now, by the way, the Jewish tradition was that the destruction of the temple by the Romans was on the same day that the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians occurred. Now, that's their tradition. We don't know for a fact that that's the case, because we don't know what day it was from a historical standpoint that Babylon destroyed it. But the point was, they didn't miss that the picture was the same, and the destruction of the temple was something that God had ordained in the time of Jeremiah, and God ordained here as well. And so it's very interesting that how history repeats itself, and not just coincidentally. This is actually God intentionally repeating history.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good point. Tom, I got a question for you, and this is in the outline as well. Jesus says, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. Brian mentioned that just a moment ago. So what does this say about the future of the city of Jerusalem? And does history support this warning?
What it's saying about the future of Jerusalem is that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And one of the things we've been alluding to throughout our studies here today is the fact that the end of the Jewish system of worship was going to happen. And somebody mentioned take away Jerusalem, and you take away Judaism. In effect, you end Judaism, and that's an absolutely true statement. So there's no question that this is dealing with God's wrath is going to be poured out on the physical nation of the Jews, and it would deal with the city of Jerusalem. So I do think it's clearly pointing toward that.
Okay.
The idea of trampled by the Gentiles, we know that Rome was involved in the destruction of Jerusalem, And it has been so even to this day.
Well, and you look, hasn't there been a historical struggle over the city of Jerusalem between the Muslims and those
Oh,
who call
absolutely.
themselves Christians? I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And like you said, that continues to this day. You know, I mean, you know, it's kind of interesting when you think about Judaism today, and they're grasping to hold on to relevance from a religious standpoint. All they have in Jerusalem is a foundational wall.
yeah,
You know, that's it. And if you think about that, that's really a good indicator or a good description of Judaism today. It's a grasping for that last straw, just trying to hold on to a last thing that is there. You know, and of course they're still hoping for their Messiah to come. And sadly, we got many in the denominational world who profess premillennialism that are hoping for the same thing. You know, they're grasping for the Lord to return and reestablish Judaism. It's just not going to happen, and passages like this tell us
yeah.
that it's not going to happen.
That's right. We do have some comments in the chat room. Let's go ahead and bring them in. Stephen James, he says, but just about all of what we read here seems to have been prophesied in Jeremiah 28, verses 15 and following. And James, or Stephen, that's absolutely right.
But
It is
Deuteronomy 28,
amazing. What?
Deuteronomy 28, you said Jeremiah.
Oh, I did, didn't I? Weird.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy, yeah, Deuteronomy 28. It does. I mean, it's interesting when you go back and read that. It lays out everything that would happen to the people. It's a very good point. Gregor, he goes on to say that. Here we go. He says, verse 22, so that all things which were written might be fulfilled. Also, verse 24, and will be led captive into all the nations. Those events, the destruction and the persecution of the church, lent to the spreading of the gospel throughout the world. That's a very good point. You know, the Christians were scattered abroad after the persecution or the stoning of Stephen there, and so they went out and they began to preach everywhere the word of God. And then when Jerusalem finally fell, the people went elsewhere, and it did promote the spreading of the word of God. Hang on just a moment. All right. All right, then one more comment. This is from Hud Griffith. Thank you, Hud, for your comments. So many people put so much emphasis on physical 21st century Jerusalem, when in fact it has absolutely no consequence to the kingdom of Christ. New Jerusalem came down from heaven, Hebrews 12, 21 through 23. That city, that is the physical Jerusalem of the 21st century, that people are looking at today, belongs to the world and has been spiritually irrelevant for almost 2,000 years. And you know what Hud there says is it's so true, and it's what much of the religious world doesn't understand. There is no relevance to that city, and has not been since the day of Pentecost, and the word began to be spread from that point. The city then was destroyed. They could build it back several times, but it will never be relevant. The heavenly city of Jerusalem, he points out in Hebrews 12. That's what we have come to today. And I love that passage in Hebrews 12. You know, we've not come to a mountain like the Israelites did when they came to Mount Zion. We have come to the spiritual Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, and so forth. Very, very good point. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? Because we need to move on.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say hi to Hud. He's in New Mexico. He attends where Steve Hutchinson, one of the men we support, is preaching in Berlin, New Mexico. So welcome to him.
Very good. Yeah. Welcome, Hud. Appreciate it. Appreciate you joining us today. All right. So with that being said, let's take a quick look at Luke 21, verses 25 through 28. And I'll go ahead and take a moment and read that. All right. So here in this particular text of Luke chapter 21, beginning of verse 25, and there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing, failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. All right. Now we have an extremely important and significant question. And let me go ahead and I'll pose this question first to Paul. And Paul, I want you to think carefully about this. It is 11:55. Do you think we have enough time to cover the rest of this in today's study?
I think in the interest of seeing that we still need to talk about the fig trees and the words of caution that Jesus offers, that probably this would be a good breaking point for us to stop and to pick up and to finish this chapter next week. I don't think we'd have to hurry through the chapter if we even including this section in our study next week.
See, here's what we would have to do. Read it and say, that's what it means, and then move to the next one. And that's where a lot of commentaries handle
what
it.
it's talking about. That might be a good thing. Just kidding.
Tom and Brian, does this sound like a good idea to you? Just kind of pause here, and we'll reread this next week and jump into this.
I think you should try to get all of it in the next 2 minutes. Yeah, I think we should.
And the cup of the day is
Brian.
Cup of the day,
Yes.
New Mexico. There you go. See.
I tell you what, we will plan to do that, because we were discussing this ahead of time, not so much whether or not to split the chapter, but we were kind of talking about, exactly what is Jesus saying here? And there are some who would take this particular reading here and make it something that applies to where it does not. And some of the options that we could have when we look at what Jesus says within these verses, and we'll talk more about this next week, could be he's talking about the kingdom that he would reign over, that happened when he ascended to the right-hand side of his Father. Or it could be talking about the end when he comes again. And so we'll talk about that more next week. I'd love to tell you that we have it all figured out, but we'll give you the best answer that we have on this, and then leave it up to you to ascertain whether or not we have a proper understanding of these things. With that said, any final thoughts or comments regarding what we have looked at so far? And Brian, let me throw it to you.
No, I appreciate that. The guys have let me talk quite a bit today, and our audience probably is wondering why I talked right over everybody else. And I appreciate you guys letting me say something, and so I can't think of anything else.
All right. Tom, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just as Jesus deals with the destruction of Jerusalem, let us not forget that God is in control of this world, and there's a great day coming, another judgment, that just as he dealt with that, he's going to deal with us. So we need to be prepared.
Okay. Paul, any final thoughts?
I just always appreciate those who have joined in with us today, and hope that you'll come back and finish the chapter with us next week.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. And I've not been following my email that would have been fed by the actual viewing page. Any comments there, so I apologize for that. If anything was submitted through that page, I'll go back and we'll bring it in next week.
I think I get those too, John, and I don't believe we had any emails. So
okay, none made it in. All right, thank you, Paul. All right, well then, let's go ahead and plan to sign off today. We'll pick up with our study there, and I think it's verse 25 next Wednesday, and that'll be at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
And if you're in the Eastern United States time zone, that will be at noon.
And,
Sorry,
and
Paul.
9 a.m. on the Pacific Coast.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
That's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.